Hello, dear friend, and welcome to this quiet corner of the evening. I find myself wondering, where in this wide world are you listening tonight? Are you tucked beneath a heavy woven blanket, or perhaps watching the soft shadows lengthen across a dim and peaceful room? Wherever you may be, I invite you to loosen your shoulders, breathe out the rushing currents of the day, and step across the threshold into a place of profound warmth and timeless intrigue. We find ourselves climbing the 17 familiar, slightly creaking steps to the sitting room of 221B Baker Street on a particularly dreary London night. Outside, a steady rhythmic rain taps a gentle, hypnotic melody against the window pane, while the distant, hollow clatter of horse hooves on wet cobblestones fades softly into the rolling fog. Inside, the atmosphere is a pure sanctuary of sensory comfort. The air is thick with the soothing, intertwined scents of old paper, steeped black tea, and the rich, earthen notes of Sherlock Holmes pipe tobacco. Amber gas lamps cast a soft, golden glow across the scattered leather-bound volumes and peculiar artefacts that clutter the beloved room. A heavy wooden clock ticks away the slow hours upon the mantelpiece, keeping perfect time with the rhythmic popping crackle of the roaring hearth where Holmes and Dr. Watson sit together in comfortable contemplative silence. The dancing firelight flickers across Holmes' sharp features as he slowly leans forward, his sharp attention suddenly caught by a hesitant knock at the parlour door. It is a weary client dripping with the cold London rain, bringing a puzzle perfectly suited for such an atmospheric night. A quiet, impossible tale of a grand stone hearth that burns brilliantly through the darkest hours, yet in the morning light leaves behind absolutely no ashes at all. The rain fell upon London with a quiet and relentless sorrow, sweeping across the dark slate roofs in shimmering waves and tapping gently against the cold glass of our windows at Baker Street. Inside our sitting room, the world was safely reduced to the warm amber glow of the gas lamps and the familiar comforting scent of burning coal mingled with the rich, earthy notes of Sherlock Holmes's favoured pipe tobacco. The fire in our own grate crackled and popped, sending small showers of golden sparks dancing upward into the soot-stained chimney, providing a stark and cheerful contrast to the dreary grey afternoon that enveloped the sprawling city in a cold, damp embrace. Holmes sat draped in his heavy dressing gown, his long, pale fingers steepled delicately beneath his chin, his sharp, predatory eyes half closed as though he were lost in some distant dream, though I knew well that his mind was moving with the swift, silent grace of a hawk circling unseen prey. I sat opposite him, holding a worn cloth-bound book whose pages felt soft and heavy in my hands, the faint, sweet scent of old paper rising to meet me every time I turned a leaf. It was an afternoon built entirely for silence, a day where the heavy moisture in the air seemed to swallow all noise from the streets below, leaving only the hypnotic rhythm of the rain against the pane and the steady, heartbeat ticking of the mantel clock to mark the slow passing of the hours. The profound stillness of our sanctuary was broken, not by a shout or a sudden alarm, but by the heavy, hurried clatter of horse hooves striking the wet cobblestones with a frantic urgency, followed closely by the grating scrape of carriage wheels pulled to a sudden and violent halt. I lowered my book and peered through the streaked window pane, watching as a tall, heavily cloaked figure descended from the cab, his movements jagged and nervous, like a man who felt he was being closely pursued by unseen shadows. A moment later, the heavy brass bell downstairs rang with an urgent, lingering vibration that seemed to travel upward and echo through the floorboards of our room. We listened in silence to the muffled murmur of our landlady in the hallway below, the slow, but heavy, waterlogged tread of boots ascending the 17 stairs, and then came a polite but desperate rap upon our door. When the man finally entered, bringing with him the damp, metallic smell of the London storm and the biting chill of the street, I saw at once that he was a gentleman of considerable wealth and breeding, yet he appeared entirely undone by some invisible, lingering terror. His fine wool coat was sodden and heavy at the shoulders, his silver-tipped walking stick trembled violently in his gloved hands, and his pale, wide eyes darted about the darkened corners of our sitting room, as if he fully expected the shadows themselves to leap out and consume him. Holmes did not rise from his chair, but simply waved a languid, elegant hand toward the empty armchair near the hearth, his voice a low and soothing murmur that cut through the gentleman's palpable panic like a warm, steady breeze. He quietly invited our guest to sit, to warm his trembling hands by the flames, and to allow the absolute peace of the room to settle his frayed nerves before attempting to speak a single word. Our landlady appeared in the doorway like a quiet phantom, carrying a silver tray laden with steaming porcelain cups, the fragrant steam of dark multi-Assam tea rising to mingle with the drifting clouds of tobacco smoke. Our visitor reached for a cup, the fine bone china rattling loudly against the saucer in his unsteady grip, and he drank the scalding liquid in long gulps without seeming to notice the burning heat upon his tongue. After a long moment of heavy silence, he introduced himself as Lord Arthur Penhaligon, the master of a sprawling and ancient ancestral estate nestled deep within the undulating, fog-choked moors of the West Country. His voice was a thin, ragged whisper, a hollow sound born of too many sleepless nights, and a deep, unrelenting fear that had settled into his very bones. He told us, his gaze fixed firmly on the dancing flames in our grate, that he had fled his home 3 days prior, driven entirely mad by a silent terror that had suddenly taken root in the very heart of the manor, a terror that defied every known law of nature, reason, and sanity. Holmes leaned forward slightly, the flickering firelight catching the sharp, patrician angles of his face, his eyes gleaming with the sudden, quiet thrill of a dark puzzle that promised to test the rigid boundaries of the known world. Penhaligon set his teacup down upon the small table with a hollow clatter and buried his face in his shaking hands, releasing a long, shuddering sigh that seemed to carry with it the scent of damp stone, decaying autumn leaves, and profound despair. When he finally found the strength to speak of the mystery that had driven him from his ancestral home, his words flowed in a slow, hypnotic stream, pulling us effortlessly into the dark, echoing corridors of his distant, windswept house. He spoke of the old study situated deep within the secluded east wing, a grand, wood-panelled room that had belonged exclusively to his late grandfather, a famously reclusive man who had spent his final, solitary years surrounded by dusty tomes, faded maps, and strange, polished alchemical instruments. Following his grandfather's passing some 2 decades ago, the heavy oak door to the room had been locked and left entirely untouched, becoming a silent, sealed tomb meant to preserve the eccentricities and quiet memory of a forgotten era. But exactly a fortnight ago, in the dead of a freezing, moonless night, Penhaligon had been walking the darkened halls, unable to sleep, when he noticed a faint, unnatural glow seeping from beneath the heavy timber of the study door. He described the light in a hushed whisper, calling it a cold, sickly amber, entirely devoid of the rich, comforting warmth one expects from a hearth, a light that cast long, writhing shadows that seemed to claw desperately at the edges of the polished floorboards. Believing that a fire had somehow inexplicably broken out in the locked and abandoned room, he had immediately summoned his loyal steward, and together the 2 men had forced the ancient, rusted lock, bursting into the study with heavy wooden pails of water, drawn hurriedly from the freezing courtyard well. But what they found waiting for them in the gloom, he whispered, his eyes wide and unblinking in the soft gaslight of our sitting room, was a scene of such quiet impossibility that it had shattered his fundamental understanding of the natural world. The grand, carved stone fireplace at the far end of the dusty study was roaring ablaze, but it was a fire unlike any that had ever burned upon the surface of the earth. The flames were incredibly tall and entirely silent, moving in a slow, almost viscous dance, a mesmerizing and profoundly horrifying spectacle of brilliant light accompanied by an absolute vacuum of sound. There was no cheerful crackle of dry, heating sap, no sharp hiss of escaping moisture, no gentle, settling shifting of glowing embers falling into the grate. But the true horror, the specific detail that made Penhaligon's hands shake so violently that he had to physically clasp them tight against his knees to steady himself, was the condition of the wood itself. 3 heavy, thick logs of seasoned oak rested squarely upon the blackened iron grate, entirely engulfed in the roaring amber inferno, yet they were absolutely and miraculously untouched by the violent flames that licked at their bark. The rough exterior of the wood remained perfectly intact and uncharred, the pale heartwood beneath showing not the slightest sign of blackening or scorching, and nowhere within the deep stone hearth was there a single, solitary grain of grey ash to suggest that anything had ever been consumed. The strange fire gave off a heavy, oppressive odour, possessing none of the familiar comforting scent of wood smoke, but smelling instead of something ancient and metallic, resembling the sharp ozonic tang in the air just moments before a massive thunderstorm splits the sky. And though the silent flames leaped high into the blackened chimney breast, illuminating the entire room in their sickly glow, the study was freezing cold, the air so unnaturally frigid that Penhaligon and his steward could clearly see their own terrified breath pluming in the amber light. In a panic, they had doused the impossible fire with their heavy pails of water, but the freezing liquid had simply passed directly through the roaring flames as if they were nothing more than a phantom trick of the light, pooling harmlessly and soaking into the cold stone of the hearth without producing a single wisp of steam. For 14 consecutive nights, the silent cold fire had continued to burn without pause and without fuel. Penhaligon had locked the heavy oak door once more, but the freezing amber light continued to bleed out into the dark hallway every night, a constant silent and glowing mockery of reality that drove sleep from the house. The household servants had quickly begun to flee one by one, whispering terrified tales of ancient family curses and restless, punishing spirits, leaving the vast, sprawling manor empty, echoing and entirely at the mercy of the strange phenomenon. The nobleman himself had not slept a full night since the discovery, haunted by the creeping, dreadful feeling that the silent, ashless fire was somehow feeding not on physical wood, but on the very soul and memory of the house itself. Holmes sat back deep in his chair, his fingertips pressed together in a perfect steeple, his sharp eyes fixed intensely upon the gently glowing red coals in our own entirely ordinary and comforting fireplace. Our sitting room remained swathed in a heavy, contemplative silence, save for the rhythmic, weeping tapping of the rain against the window glass, the sound seeming somehow louder now, as if the cold outside world were desperately trying to press its way into our sanctuary. It was a problem that appealed instantly to the deepest, most complex recesses of Holmes's intellect, a bizarre mystery woven of pure shadow, quiet terror, and glaring physical impossibility. Without a single word of negotiation, hesitation, or doubt, my friend simply nodded his head slowly, his voice soft, low, and resonant, as he promised our trembling client that we would pack our bags immediately, take the very next train heading to the distant West Country, and stand before this fireplace without ashes to unravel the hidden truth concealed within its cold, silent flames. The necessary transition from our warm, pipe-scented sitting room to the cavernous, echoing vault of the London railway station was a rapid blur of damp wool overcoats, slick, rain-washed pavements, and the heavy, sulphurous smell of locomotive steam billowing into the grey sky. We found ourselves seated quietly in a private, velvet-lined compartment as the great iron beast lurched heavily into motion, the deep groan of metal pulling us steadily away from the familiar sprawling chaos of the city and out into the vast, grey and quiet expanse of the English countryside. The rhythmic, driving clacking of the heavy steel wheels over the iron rails quickly became a hypnotic metronome, a steady, driving and comforting pulse that carried us deeper and deeper into the encroaching mist of the moors. I sat by the window and watched through the rain-streaked glass as the densely packed brickwork of the city gradually dissolved into sprawling empty fields and dark skeletal woodlands, the world outside painted entirely in muted, melancholy shades of charcoal, slate, and pale grey. The heavy rain had eventually ceased, only to be replaced by a thick, clinging, and luminous fog that rolled slowly across the undulating hills like a slow, white tide, swallowing entire farming villages and leaving only the towering, lonely spires of distant country churches rising faintly above the impenetrable gloom. Inside our compartment, the air was warm, close, and smelled faintly of worn velvet upholstery, damp leather luggage, and the sharp, comforting and familiar tang of Holmes's pipe tobacco. My companion sat perfectly still in the corner seat, his tweed travelling cap pulled low over his prominent brow, his eyes closed in deep concentration as he wandered the complex labyrinthine corridors of his own brilliant mind, carefully turning the nobleman's impossible tale over and over, examining every word and detail from every conceivable angle in total silence. The long hours of the journey slowly bled into one another, marked only by the gentle rocking sway of the railway carriage and the occasional mournful, echoing wail of the train whistle sounding across the desolate, empty moors. As the pale afternoon slowly faded into a bruised purple and heavily shadowed twilight, the passing landscape grew noticeably wilder, more desolate and untamed, the gentle rolling green hills giving way to jagged, broken outcroppings of dark stone and deep shadowed valleys completely filled with thick clinging mist. I found myself gradually lulled into a state of quiet, dreamlike reflection, my mind wandering freely between the comforting mechanical rhythm of the train and the chilling supernatural prospect of the cold, silent flames that quietly awaited us at our dark destination. We drank strong tea poured steaming from a metal thermos, the dark liquid tasting slightly of tin and deep warmth, a small grounding sensation of reality amidst the creeping atmospheric unreality of our impending investigation. Penhaligon sat directly across from me in the dim compartment, wrapped tightly in his heavy damp overcoat, his pale eyes staring blankly at the frosted window glass, completely lost in terrifying memories and a profound dread that he simply could not escape. When the train finally groaned to a halt and we disembarked at the lonely windswept rural station, the dark night had fully descended across the land, bringing with it a biting, damp chill that seemed to bypass my heavy overcoat entirely and seep straight into my bones. The desolate wooden platform was illuminated by a single, wildly flickering oil lamp swinging from a rusted iron bracket, casting long, trembling and distorted shadows across the damp, rotting wooden boards, the sharp smell of burning paraffin mixing heavily with the raw, earthy and decaying scent of the wild moorland. A solitary black horse-drawn carriage waited for us patiently in the absolute gloom, the silent coachman wrapped so thoroughly in dark, heavy cloaks that he appeared as little more than a solid, faceless silhouette against the encroaching fog. The horse, a massive, heavy-hooved creature, with a thick coat the exact colour of wet slate, stamped its iron-shod hooves impatiently against the stones, its hot breath pluming wildly into the freezing night air, looking much like the exhaust steam from the mighty locomotive we had just left behind. We climbed silently into the carriage, the cracked leather seats feeling terribly cold and unyielding beneath us, and began the final, arduous leg of our long journey, embarking upon a slow, punishing climb up the winding, deeply rutted dirt track that led out across the empty heather toward the isolated Penhaligon estate. The heavy carriage rocked and pitched violently in the darkness, the iron-rimmed wheels grinding harshly against loose, wet stones and sinking deep into channels of hardened, freezing mud. Outside the small glass windows the fog was absolute and suffocating, pressing tightly against the carriage like a wall of solid, impenetrable white, completely obscuring any sense of direction, distance, or the passage of time. The only sounds in the isolated darkness were the heavy, laboured and rhythmic breathing of the struggling horse, the loud, protesting creak of the wooden carriage springs under our combined weight, and the low, mournful and continuous howling of the bitter wind as it swept violently across the open, treeless heather, a sound that deeply resembled the distant, sorrowful cries of lost and wandering souls. I could physically feel the heavy, suffocating tension radiating from Lord Penhaligon sitting beside me in the dark, his unspoken terror growing exponentially with every agonizing mile that dragged him closer to his haunted ancestral home. Holmes remained completely enveloped in his own silent, calculating observation, his sharp senses tuned not to the palpable fear of our trembling companion, but to the deep physical atmosphere of the hostile land itself, silently feeling the shifting, steep gradients of the road and the subtly changing, heavy pressure of the damp air as we climbed higher and higher into the desolate, empty hills. After what truly felt like an eternity locked in the swaying dark, the carriage finally ground to a heavy, exhausted halt, and we stepped slowly out into the biting, freezing wind to finally face the looming Penhaligon estate. It emerged slowly from the shifting sea of fog like the dark, rotting hull of a colossal, sunken galleon, a massive, sprawling structure composed of dark, weathered and unyielding stone that seemed to absorb the faint, struggling moonlight rather than reflect it. The many windows of the manor were remarkably tall and narrow, strongly resembling completely empty, watchful eyes, staring blankly out across the vast, empty moor, entirely devoid of the welcoming, warm glow of candlelight or human habitation. The heavy, towering wooden front door, heavily reinforced with thick, studded bands of blackened iron, stood waiting ominously at the very top of a short, wide flight of stone steps, the centre of each step worn smooth and hollow by the passage of centuries of silent footfalls. The very air surrounding the dark house felt strangely heavy and thick, deeply charged with a subtle, unnerving static energy that actually made the fine hairs on my arms stand on end and left a faint coppery and metallic taste lingering unpleasantly upon my tongue. We followed Penhaligon silently up the cold steps, the sharp sound of our leather boots echoing unnaturally loud in the oppressive dead silence of the property, and as the nobleman turned a heavy rusted brass key in the ancient lock, the massive door swung slowly inward with a long, drawn-out, and agonizing groan that echoed deeply through the dark, cavernous and empty hallway waiting beyond. We stepped tentatively over the threshold and directly into the dark belly of the beast, enveloped immediately by a profound, chilling and suffocating dampness, a specific stagnant cold that felt entirely different from the wild, moving winter wind out upon the moors. It was the heavy, settled and breathless cold of entirely forgotten places, smelling strongly of thick dust, decaying, moth-eaten wall tapestries, and the slow, inevitable crumbling of ancient stone mortar turning to sand in the dark. The grand entrance hall before us was incredibly vast and heavily shadowed, its high, ornately vaulted ceiling lost completely in the impenetrable gloom high above our heads, the dark oak-panelled walls lined with the tall, faded, and peeling portraits of stern Penhaligon ancestors who seemed to scowl fiercely down at our intrusion from the absolute darkness. Holmes calmly reached into his travel satchel and produced a small brass dark lantern, smoothly striking a sulphur match with a sharp echoing hiss that momentarily blinded me with its sudden brilliant flare. The yellow flame caught and flared to life within the glass, casting long, wavering and dancing beams of golden light that stretched far across the heavily polished oak floorboards, occasionally catching the dull, menacing gleam of empty antique plate armour standing like silent hollow sentinels in the distant dusty corners of the hall. We moved forward with extreme deliberate slowness, our cautious footsteps heavily muffled by a long threadbare and faded crimson carpet that ran the entire length of the grand hall, the profound, unnatural silence of the massive house pressing inward against our ears with a very real and heavy physical weight. Penhaligon led us silently past wide, sweeping grand staircases disappearing into the upper darkness and through a series of long, terribly draughty corridors, moving steadily deeper and deeper into the abandoned, secluded east wing of the great manor. As we walked through the gloom, the ambient temperature of the house seemed to drop even further, creating an unnatural, penetrating chill that bit straight through the heavy wool of my clothing and settled deeply and painfully into the marrow of my bones. But it was not merely the plunging cold that signalled our creeping approach to the forbidden locked study. It was a very subtle, yet deeply unsettling shift in the very physical atmosphere of the dark corridor itself. I slowly began to smell it in the stagnant air, that incredibly strange, ancient and deeply metallic scent our frightened client had accurately described in our sitting room, a dry, sharp and highly unnatural odour that irritated the soft back of the throat and carried absolutely no hint or trace of naturally burning wood. And then, as we slowly and cautiously turned the final, shadowed corner and stepped into a long, incredibly narrow and silent hallway, we finally saw it. Escaping from beneath the heavy, tightly fitted oak door at the very far end of the passage, a thin, brilliant line of sickly, pulsating amber light spilled out boldly across the dusty floorboards, a slow, crawling, and liquid illumination that seemed almost to possess a sinister life of its own. It did not flicker rapidly or dance erratically like any natural wind-blown flame. Instead, it pulsed outward with a slow, steady, and terrifying rhythmic intensity, a sickening, silent heartbeat of unnatural light that successfully cast extremely long, writhing and unnatural shadows along the lengths of the dark panelled corridor walls. Penhaligon stopped dead in his tracks, pressing his back tightly against the cold panelled wall of the hallway, his breathing becoming terribly ragged, fast and shallow, absolutely refusing to take even one single step further toward the impossible glowing room. Holmes simply moved forward with the silent, fluid and mesmerising grace of a hunting cat stalking its prey, his pale grey eyes perfectly reflecting the strange pulsating amber glow from beneath the door, his sharp face set completely in an intense expression of absolute unyielding focus and pure intellectual desire. I followed very closely behind him, my heart suddenly hammering a frantic, loud and painful rhythm against my ribs, my right hand instinctively dropping deep into the heavy pocket of my overcoat to rest tightly upon the cold, reassuring and heavy weight of my service revolver, even though I knew deep down in my trembling soul that absolutely no weapon forged of simple iron and lead would be of any earthly use against whatever deep mystery lay waiting beyond that glowing door. We finally stood together directly before the heavy oak barrier, the solid wood of the door feeling strangely and painfully cold to my touch, the metallic, ozonic scent now completely overpowering, mingling deeply with a profound, silent and vibrating hum in the air that I felt physically in the centre of my chest rather than heard with my ears. Holmes reached his hand out slowly, his long, pale fingers wrapping firmly around the freezing ornate iron of the heavy door handle, and slowly, with perfect, deliberate calm, he turned the metal latch, the sharp, mechanical click echoing loudly like a fired gunshot down the length of the silent waiting hallway. He pushed the heavy door steadily inward, and the blinding, silent, freezing amber light immediately spilled outward to swallow us both entirely whole, silently inviting us to step boldly across the threshold and directly into an impossible room where the fundamental, unbreakable laws of the universe had just been quietly and terrifyingly rewritten. The deep hours of the night descended upon the ancient estate with the quiet weight of a heavy velvet shroud settling over a forgotten world. Inside the haunted study, the silence was an almost physical presence, a thick and atmospheric stillness that seemed to press against the tall windows where the moonlight struggled to pierce the fog. We sat together in the suffocating dark, two silent sentinels swallowed by the plush leather of the high-backed wing chairs, our breaths measured and shallow so as not to disturb the fragile peace of the room. The air was rich with the complex odours of antiquity, a comforting yet melancholic blend of crumbling parchment, binding glue that had dried out a century ago, the faint metallic tang of old brass instruments, and the lingering ghost of the strong shag tobacco my companion favoured, which clung stubbornly to the heavy tapestry curtains. Outside, a gentle, persistent rain began to fall, its soft drumming against the leaded glass sounding like the tapping of 1,000 tiny restless fingers. The wind would occasionally sigh through the great oak trees beyond the garden, a mournful sound that rustled the wet leaves and brought the smell of damp earth and decaying wood seeping through the invisible cracks of the window frames. Time moved with an agonizingly deliberate pace, measured only by the rhythmic, hollow heartbeat of the grand mahogany clock in the corner of the room. Each swing of its heavy brass pendulum sliced through the quiet with a soft, sweeping thud, a sound that ordinarily would bring a sense of domestic tranquility, but tonight only served to heighten the creeping tension that wound itself tight in the pit of my stomach. Holmes sat opposite me, completely obscured by the shadows, yet I could feel the intense, coiled energy of his presence, a silent predator waiting with infinite patience in the blind dark. He had not moved a singular muscle for the better part of 3 hours, his breathing so incredibly faint that I had to strain my ears over the patter of the rain to ensure he was still waking beside me. Only the faintest glimmer of ambient moonlight catching the sharp plane of his cheekbone betrayed his position, his eyes undoubtedly fixed unblinking upon the gaping black maw of the grand stone fireplace that dominated the far wall. It was a cavernous structure, built in a time when whole logs were brought in by horses to warm the vast halls, yet tonight it stood empty, swept clean of soot and wood, waiting for the spectral manifestation that was slowly driving the young heir of the estate into the dark corridors of madness. As the hands of the grandfather clock crawled toward the witching hour, the atmosphere in the study began to undergo a subtle, chilling transformation. It began not with a sound, but with a sudden, precipitous drop in the temperature of the air, a profound chill that crept across the floorboards and seeped through the thick wool of my trousers, bringing with it the unmistakable scent of something ancient and disturbed. It was a smell I could not entirely place, lacking the familiar sulphurous bite of coal smoke or the sweet resin of burning pine, replacing those worldly scents with a strange arid crispness that reminded me of overturned grave dirt and the dry ozone left behind by a violent lightning strike. I shifted ever so slightly in my chair, the leather creaking in protest, a sound that seemed deafening in the suspended silence. Holmes raised a single long finger in the darkness, a silent command for absolute stillness, and I froze. my heart beating a frantic, irregular rhythm against my ribs as I directed my gaze toward the empty hearth. Midnight began to toll, the deep, resonant chimes echoing from the distant village church tower, swimming through the dense fog to reach our ears in muffled, mournful waves. On the final, lingering strike of the bell, the absolute darkness within the fireplace began to bleed. It did not ignite with the sudden, comforting crackle of an ordinary flame, but rather suffused with a slow, creeping luminescence that seemed to crawl up from the very pores of the stone floor. It was a sickly, pale illumination, the colour of spoiled milk and crushed pearls, casting an eerie, phosphorescent halo that completely lacked the warmth of a natural fire. The ghostly light writhed and shifted without a sound, a silent, twisting vapour that curled around the iron fire dogs and licked at the soot-stained bricks with cold, glowing tongues. It was a terrifyingly beautiful sight, a supernatural performance that bathed the study in a haunting aquamarine radiance, stretching our shadows into long, grotesque shapes that danced wildly against the walls of books. The strange illumination revealed the utter absence of any fuel or ash within the grate. An impossible fire burning on bare stone, exactly as the terrified young heir had described during his desperate plea for our help. I felt a cold sweat break out upon my brow as the ghostly phenomenon intensified, the pale light expanding to fill the hearth, illuminating the intricate carvings of the stone mantelpiece until the gargoyles and twisting vines seemed to writhe with a sinister borrowed life. I instinctively reached toward the pocket of my jacket, my fingers brushing the cold, reassuring steel of my service revolver, though I knew in my rational mind that bullets would do little against an ethereal spectre. Yet, as I watched the impossible fire, my senses began to piece together a reality that contradicted the supernatural dread clutching at my mind. The air, though cold, moved with a deliberate, unnatural draft, or a current that smelled sharply of chemical salts and damp subterranean tunnels rather than the spirit world. It was in this moment of sensory realization that my companion finally moved. Holmes rose from his armchair with the absolute silence and fluid grace of a creature born to the night. He did not step back in awe or fear, but rather leaned forward, his lean silhouette cutting a dark void against the glowing spectral hearth. He crept across the Persian rug without making a single sound, his shoulders hunched, his head thrust forward as he brought his face dangerously close to the source of the pale, writhing light. The eerie illumination painted his sharp features in stark, dramatic relief, turning his eyes into twin pools of focused, gleaming intellect. I watched, breathless, as he knelt upon the cold stone hearth, reaching out a bare hand not to touch the glowing vapour itself, but to gently wave the air above it, wafting the strange, dry scent toward his discerning nose. A low, soft sound of immense satisfaction vibrated from his chest, a quiet hum that completely shattered the oppressive spell of the supernatural that had held the room captive. He motioned for me to join him, his gesture urgent but constrained by the necessary quiet of our vigil. I abandoned the safety of my armchair and moved across the room, the floorboards groaning ever so slightly beneath my weight. As I drew near the fireplace, the true nature of the light became apparent. It offered no heat whatsoever. In fact, the air directly before the hearth was bitterly cold, rushing outward in a steady, chilling stream. The glowing mist was not fire at all, but a fine, luminescent dust caught in an invisible, powerful current of air, swirling and dancing in a carefully orchestrated imitation of flames. Holmes had already produced his small silver magnifying glass, angling it to catch the pale light as he inspected the bare, seemingly solid stone floor of the fireplace. His long, sensitive fingers traced the blackened masonry with the delicate precision of a blind man reading the face of a loved one, searching the microscopic imperfections of the mortar. "Listen to the wind, Watson," he whispered, his voice a barely audible thread of sound that barely disturbed the quiet, yet resonated with an unmistakable thrill of discovery. "Do you hear how it whistles through the chimney stack above, yet no draught comes down to disturb the ashes of a normal fire? The architecture of this grand old house has been turned into a weapon of psychological terror." He pressed his ear against the cold stone of the inner wall, closing his eyes as he listened to the hidden heartbeat of the estate. The young master of the house believed his ancestors were crawling from the very foundations to drag him into the flames of purgatory, but the truth is far more earthbound and entirely more sinister. Watch the stone, my friend. Watch the mortar, exactly where the floor meets the back wall. I knelt beside him, the cold from the hearth biting through my trousers, and stared intently at the spot he indicated. In the shifting, eerie glow of the false fire, I could barely make out a hairline fracture in the soot-stained masonry, a perfectly straight line that defied the natural crumbling of ancient mortar. As the wind outside howled a particularly violent gust, throwing rain against the windowpane with a sharp, rattling sound, the hairline fracture seemed to widen for just a fraction of a second. A fresh burst of the glowing, pale mist shot upward from the crack, fueling the spectral fire and sending a fresh wave of the sharp, metallic scent into the study. Holmes smiled, a quick, feral baring of teeth in the ghostly light. "A magnificent piece of engineering," he murmured, his hands moving quickly to trace the perimeter of the stone slab. "A hidden ventilation shaft, likely an old priest hole or forgotten servant's draught, entirely repurposed for this cruel theatrical display. It connects directly to the cellars below, acting as a natural bellows. Whenever the wind blows across the grating on the eastern side of the estate, it forces a powerful current of air through the forgotten tunnels, rushing upward and escaping through this cleverly hinged stone. But a draught is nothing without the illusion of fire, and our perpetrator has proven to be a chemist of extraordinary, if deeply malicious, talent." He reached into the deep pocket of his tweed coat and withdrew a small empty glass vial, the kind he frequently used for collecting obscure soil samples or traces of poison. With extraordinary care, he scraped the rim of the glass along the edge of the hidden fracture, collecting a minuscule amount of the fine, glowing dust before capping it tightly. He held the vial up between us. In the absolute darkness of the room, the trapped dust continued to emit a faint, sickly green luminescence, a tiny captive ghost imprisoned in glass. "Barium sulfide," he whispered, his voice smooth and low, settling over the terrifying atmosphere like a calming balm. Specifically a variant known as lapis solaris, or the Bolognian stone, heavily calcined and mixed with traces of bismuth and a rare, highly reactive phosphorescent mineral originating from the deep caves of the continent. It is an alchemical curiosity, Watson, a substance that absorbs ambient light during the day and emits this cold, terrifying glow in the darkness. But to make it dance, to make it mimic the chaotic, reaching tongues of a fire from hell, requires the mechanical ingenuity we see before us. I stared at the vial, the pieces of the puzzle slowly sliding into place within my mind. The horror that had been inflicted upon the young heir, the sleepless nights, the visions of a cold fire that promised damnation without the mercy of heat. It was not a haunting, but a meticulously calculated psychological assassination. The perpetrator, Holmes continued softly, turning the vial in his fingers so the pale light washed over his sharp nose and deep-set eyes, has ground this mineral down to an impossibly fine powder, finer than the dust of a moth's wing. They have placed a reservoir of this powder within the hidden draft shaft just beneath this hearth. When the wind catches the tunnels, it acts as a pneumatic pump, forcing the glowing dust up through the cracks and into the room. The natural convection of the cold air mingling with the slightly warmer air of the study causes the dust to swirl and eddy, creating the perfect illusion of a spectral, ashless flame. The cruelty of it sent a fresh shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold draft. "They are trying to drive him mad," I whispered back, mindful of the vast sleeping house around us. "They are using the legend of his grandfather's wicked deeds, the stories of the cursed fireplace, to break his mind and force him to surrender the estate." "Exactly so," Holmes replied, gracefully rising to his feet and slipping the glowing vial back into the dark recesses of his coat. The young man's nervous system is already fragile, overwrought with the burdens of a sudden inheritance and the heavy, melancholic atmosphere of this isolated manor. The sudden appearance of this cold fire, accompanied by the strange metallic odour that plays upon the olfactory senses to induce a feeling of primitive dread, was designed to be the final blow to his sanity. It is an elegant, bloodless murder of the mind. Holmes stepped back from the hearth, his hands clasped firmly behind his back as he surveyed the grand, shadowed room. "We must dismantle the mechanism," he stated quietly, "but not before we trap the architect of this misery. The powder reservoir must be replenished periodically. Barium sulfide of this particular volatility will lose its luminescent properties if exposed to the damp air of the cellar for more than a few days. Our ghost is bound by the laws of chemistry, and must walk the hidden corridors to feed his supernatural fire, we need only to follow the draught backward, down into the bowels of the house, and wait in the damp darkness for the phantom to arrive with his mortar and pestle. The rain continued to beat its gentle rhythm against the glass, a soothing counterpoint to the quiet, brilliant unravelling of the mystery. The ghostly fire in the hearth began to wane as the wind outside momentarily died down, the pale light flickering and sinking back into the invisible crack in the stone, leaving the fireplace once again empty, black, and completely devoid of ashes. The oppressive dread that had filled the study just moments ago had completely evaporated, replaced by the calm, methodical anticipation of the hunt. We had faced the supernatural terror of the dark and found beneath it only the cold, calculating machinery of human greed, illuminated by the soft, whispering voice of reason that my companion carried with him wherever the shadows grew too deep. We turned away from the cold hearth, leaving the haunted study behind as we slipped silently through the heavy oak doors, thus beginning our long descent into the lightless cellars where the true monster of the estate was waiting to be unmasked. The shadows stretched across the Aubusson carpet like long fingers, tracing the faded floral patterns in the dim moonlight that managed to slip past the heavy velvet drapes. We sat in the profound quiet of the ancestral home, a house that had stood for centuries against the moors and the wind, holding its secrets within its thick stone walls. The air in the study was dense with the aroma of beeswax, aged leather bindings, and the faint melancholic scent of dried lavender that seemed to seep from the very floorboards. Beside me, Holmes was nothing more than a deeper patch of darkness in the high-backed wing chair, his breathing so shallow and measured that he might have been a statue carved from the night itself. I kept my hands folded softly in my lap, feeling the slight chill of the room settle into my bones, listening to the rhythmic, hypnotic tapping of an overgrown rose branch against the window pane. The storm that had raged earlier in the evening had softened into a persistent whispering drizzle, weeping against the glass in a constant sorrowful murmur that wrapped the estate in a cocoon of isolation. It was the perfect hour for the culmination of a mystery that suspended time between the deepest part of the night and the first, hesitant promise of dawn, when the world is asleep and the truth walks unhindered through the empty corridors. The fireplace before us, the very centre of the terrible illusion that had plagued the young heir, stood as a cavernous black maw in the wall, entirely empty and unnaturally clean. There was no scent of wood smoke, no residual warmth, no dusting of white ash or charred remains of oak logs. It was a sterile abyss, and yet, night after night, it had been the source of a roaring spectral inferno that vanished as completely as a phantom the moment the door was thrown open. I thought of the young man resting upstairs, his mind exhausted by the relentless, fiery visions that had threatened to unmoor his reason, his tea laced with a subtle cruelty that made the impossible seem terrifyingly real. The house groaned above us, the settling of old timbers sounding like a long tired sigh, and then, cutting through the ambient whispers of the night, came the distinct, deliberate sound of a key turning in a well-oiled lock. The heavy oak door of the study opened with a slowness that bespoke infinite caution, the brass hinges offering only the faintest murmur of resistance. A draught of cooler air entered the room, carrying with it the smell of damp wool and the sharp, metallic tang of the night mist. A figure stepped across the threshold, moving with the practised stealth of a man who believed the shadows were his accomplices. It was the uncle, Silas, his silhouette narrow and rigid against the faint grey light of the hallway. He paused, listening to the silence of the house, unaware that the silence was listening back to him. He struck a lucifer match against the brickwork of the doorframe. The sudden, abrasive scratch, followed instantly by the violent hiss and flare of yellow sulphur. The small flame illuminated his face, casting sharp, demonic shadows in the hollows of his cheeks and painting the desperation in his wide, calculating eyes. He touched the flame to the wick of a single silver candlestick, the soft, trembling glow pushing the darkness back just far enough to reveal the edges of the room, yet leaving Holmes and myself concealed in the deep recesses of our armchairs. Silas moved toward the fireplace with a terrible, focused intent, setting the candlestick upon the mantelpiece where the light flickered over the cold stone. He reached into the deep pocket of his woolen overcoat and withdrew a small, dark velvet pouch, his fingers moving with the precise practiced motions of a craftsman preparing his tools. It was then, as he knelt upon the hearthrug to orchestrate another night of madness for his slumbering nephew, that Holmes spoke. The voice of my companion did not shatter the quiet, but rather it slipped into the silence like a dark ribbon, smooth, low, and perfectly composed. "You will find, Silas, that the drafts in this room have been entirely sealed," Holmes whispered, the words drifting across the space between them. The velvet pouch slipped from the uncle's fingers, striking the hearthstone with a dull, heavy thud. Silas froze, his body going completely rigid, his breathing catching in his throat as the impossible reality of the voice registered in his mind. He did not turn immediately, but remained kneeling, a man caught in the amber of his own unravelled scheme. Holmes rose slowly from the wing chair, stepping out of the darkness and into the periphery of the candlelight, his tall, spare frame casting a long, imposing shadow across the room. I stood beside him, my presence an unspoken reinforcement in the quiet tension of the study. Silas finally turned, his face drained of all colour, the flickering light reflecting the sudden, hollow terror in his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some blustering indignation or desperate lie, but the absolute tranquillity in Holmes's posture silenced him before a single word could be formed. "There is no need for fabrications, Silas," Holmes continued, his tone remaining gentle, almost conversational, yet possessing a gravity that pinned the man to the floor. "The tapestry of your deception has been unpicked, thread by delicate thread. You believed that by operating in the realm of the impossible, you would be immune to the scrutiny of the logical world. A fireplace that burns with the heat of a forge, yet leaves not a single speck of ash, no scent of burning wood, no trace of consumption. It is a terrifying concept to a mind already softened by chemical suggestion. A true vision of hellfire meant to fracture the sanity of a fragile young man who stood between you and the ancestral fortune." The rain continued its soft, relentless drumming against the window, the sound serving as a steady heartbeat to the unfolding revelation. Silas pushed himself up from the hearth, his movements slow and defeated, his eyes darting toward the heavy oak door as if calculating the distance to freedom. "Do not entertain thoughts of the night air," Holmes murmured, stepping slightly to intersect any potential path of flight. The local constabulary wait patiently at the end of the carriage drive, resting in the damp shadows of the iron gates. "We have a great deal of time before the dawn. And I find that understanding the mechanics of a mystery brings a certain peace to the house. Sit down, Silas. The charade is at an end." The uncle collapsed into a nearby armchair, the worn leather sighing beneath his weight. He seemed to shrink into himself, the grand, imposing figure of the concerned guardian dissolving into the pathetic reality of a ruined man. The smell of his fear, a sour, acrid perspiration, began to mingle with the beeswax and damp wool, a scent that I had encountered many times in the presence of men who had finally reached the end of their tether. Holmes did not gloat. There was no triumph in his voice, only the quiet satisfaction of a world righted, of order restored to the chaotic machinations of human greed. "Your methods were undeniably clever," Holmes said, pacing slowly across the Aubusson carpet. His hands clasped loosely behind his back. The illusion of the smokeless fire is a marvel of applied chemistry and theatrical engineering, an enterprise that requires both a deep understanding of volatile substances and a ruthless disregard for the human mind. I examined the hearth this afternoon, while you were purportedly walking the grounds to soothe your troubled nerves. The stones of the chimney are meticulously clean, completely devoid of the soot and creosote that accompany a natural wood fire. This absence was your first mistake. Even a meticulously swept hearth leaves the ghostly imprint of a flame, the subtle discoloration of the brick, the lingering memory of wood smoke. Your fire left nothing because it consumed nothing of substance. Holmes paused by the mantelpiece, his sharp gaze falling upon the small velvet pouch that lay abandoned on the hearthstone. He nudged it gently with the toe of his shoe, a soft exhalation of breath escaping his lips. You employed a highly refined mixture of lycopodium powder and a specific volatile spirit carefully calibrated to ignite with a blinding, terrifying flash of sustained combustion. It is a technique favoured by the illusionists of the continent, a fire that burns with absolute ferocity and vanishes into thin air, leaving no residue, no ash, no clinker. But a powder alone cannot sustain the roaring inferno your nephew described. the flames that seemed to dance and twist like living creatures in the belly of the fireplace. I watched as Holmes traced a long, slender finger along the underside of the stone mantelpiece, bringing his hand away to reveal a tiny, almost imperceptible groove carved into the mortar. "Here lies the true ingenuity of your mechanical trap," Holmes whispered, the candlelight catching the quiet brilliance in his eyes. A narrow, concealed pipe, tapped directly into the estate's main gas line, routed through the hollow spaces of the old chimney and ending in a series of pinprick nozzles just beneath the grate. When you sprinkled your chemical accelerant and struck the match, you simultaneously opened a hidden valve in the adjoining corridor. The result was a sudden, violent conflagration, a wall of pure, smokeless gas flame that fed upon the powder, creating an intense heat and a blinding light that roared in the confines of the brickwork. It was a spectacle designed to overwhelm the senses, a manufactured nightmare perfectly contained within the hearth. Silas sat motionless, his head bowed, the candlelight catching the damp sheen of perspiration on his forehead. The silence in the room stretched out thick and heavy, punctuated only by the soft rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the distant hall and the endless weeping of the rain. I felt a profound sense of melancholy settle over me, a sorrow for the depths to which a man would sink for the sake of a title and a collection of cold stone walls. But a theatrical trick is only half of the equation, Holmes continued, his voice dropping to an even softer register, a murmur that seemed to fill the entire room. A healthy mind, faced with an unexplainable phenomenon, will seek a rational explanation. Your nephew might have eventually investigated the hearth, might have discovered the concealed pipe or smelled the faint, lingering odour of unlit gas. You could not allow his mind to remain sharp. You needed him to doubt his own senses, to believe that the fire was a manifestation of a family curse, a demon sent to drive him from his ancestral home. And so, you turned to the subtle and insidious art of the apothecary. Holmes reached into the pocket of his own coat and withdrew a small amber glass vial, holding it up so that the candle flame fractured through the liquid within. "I found this hidden in the locked drawer of your desk, nestled among the ledgers and the mounting bills of your personal debts. A tincture of stramonium, derived from the thorn apple, mixed perhaps with a touch of belladonna. A devilish concoction, known to induce waking dreams, profound suggestibility, and terrifying auditory and visual hallucinations. You administered it with a frightening regularity, slipping a few drops into his evening tea, ensuring that by the time the midnight hour approached, his grasp on reality was as fragile as a spun glass thread. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I considered the absolute cruelty of the plan. To systematically poison a young man's mind, to distort his perception of the world until every shadow held a demon and every unexplainable sound was a harbinger of madness. It was an elegant crime, completely devoid of physical violence, yet it possessed a savagery that struck at the very core of the human soul. When the drug took hold, Holmes whispered, painting the dreadful picture with his words, you would wait in the corridor. You would listen for the shifting of his weight, the restless turning of a mind plagued by chemically induced terrors. Then, the turning of the valve, the silent rush of gas. You would enter the room like a concerned guardian, sprinkle your volatile powder, and strike the spark. To a mind swimming in the dark waters of stramonium, the sudden roaring wall of smokeless flame would not appear as a trick of gas and chemistry. It would appear as the very fires of perdition, a phantom blaze that produced no ash, a fireplace that burned with a supernatural wrath. And the moment he cried out, the moment his terror reached its zenith, you simply closed the valve in the hall. The fire vanished instantly. No embers, no smoke, no trace, only a cold, empty hearth, and a young man screaming into the darkness, believing his own mind had finally fractured beyond repair. Silas buried his face in his hands, a low, ragged sob tearing its way up from his chest. It was a sound entirely devoid of dignity, the sound of a man who realizes that the intricate, beautiful machinery of his own salvation has become the instrument of his absolute ruin. "I did it for the estate," he whispered, his voice muffled by his palms, trembling with a pathetic, desperate sorrow. "He is weak. He does not understand the legacy, the weight of the name. The debts are suffocating us. I would have managed it properly. I would have saved the house." "You would have built your salvation upon the shattered mind of an innocent," Holmes replied, his voice a cool, steady breeze that extinguished any lingering spark of sympathy. "There is no honour in preserving stones and tapestries at the cost of a human soul. The estate is secure, Silas. But it is secure from you. The young man sleeping above us will wake tomorrow with a clear mind, free from the toxic influence of your evening tea. He will find a cold hearth, but he will also find the truth, and the truth, no matter how painful, is the only foundation upon which a sane life can be built." The room fell into a long, profound silence. The storm outside seemed to have finally exhausted its fury, the drumming rain fading into a gentle, misting whisper against the glass. The heavy velvet shadows in the corners of the study seemed to soften, the oppressive weight of the unseen menace lifting from the atmosphere of the house. We remained in that suspended moment for what felt like an eternity, the three of us bound together in the quiet aftermath of the revelation, listening to the slow, steady ticking of the clock. Eventually the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed on the gravel drive outside, followed by a soft, respectful tapping at the heavy oak front door. Holmes nodded slightly toward the hallway. "That will be Inspector Lestrade and his men. They are instructed to move quietly. There is no need to wake your nephew and subject him to the spectacle of your departure. You will walk out of this house with whatever dignity you have left, and you will not return." Silas rose from the armchair, his movements stiff and mechanical, resembling a clockwork automaton whose mainspring had almost entirely unwound. He did not look at Holmes, nor did he look at me. He simply stared at the cold, empty fireplace, perhaps seeing the ghosts of his own ambition in the dark, sterile brickwork. He turned and walked slowly out of the study, his footsteps echoing softly in the hallway, followed by the muffled exchange of voices, the creaking of the front door and the crunch of gravel as the carriage bore him away into the damp grey morning. Holmes and I remained in the study for a long while after the departure. The single candle had burned down to a stub, its flame drowning in a pool of melted silver wax, casting final, dancing shadows across the Aubusson carpet. The air in the room felt distinctly lighter, the scent of fear and deceit slowly dissipating, replaced once again by the comforting aromas of old paper, beeswax and damp stone. Holmes moved to the fireplace, leaning down to retrieve the small velvet pouch of volatile powder, slipping it safely into his coat pocket. "A peculiar case, Watson," Holmes murmured, walking over to the window and pulling back the heavy velvet drape. The first fragile light of dawn was beginning to bleed into the sky, a pale, watery grey that pushed back the absolute blackness of the moors. The overgrown rose branch tapped gently against the glass, no longer a sound of suspense, but a simple, natural greeting from the awakening world. It is a reminder that the most terrifying phantoms are often those constructed by the human mind, fed by greed and amplified by shadows. When you remove the smoke and the mirrors, the supernatural dissolves into the mundane reality of pipes, valves, and powdered chemistry. We left the estate as quietly as we had arrived, ensuring the front door was securely locked behind us. The young heir slept soundly in his chambers, wrapped in the first true, that undisturbed slumber he had known in months. The morning air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of rain-washed earth, wet pine, and the faint, salty tang of the distant sea. We walked the length of the carriage drive in a companionable silence, the gravel crunching softly beneath our boots, the vast, imposing silhouette of the ancestral home standing solemn and peaceful against the brightening sky. The journey back to London was a gentle passage through the waking countryside. The rhythm of the train over the iron rails provided a steady, hypnotic cadence, lulling me into a state of deep, reflective tranquility. I watched the rolling hills and green pastures slide past the window, the morning mist clinging to the hollows like spun sugar, thinking of the dark, suffocating room we had left behind and the quiet, almost invisible war Holmes had waged against the terrors of the mind. When we finally arrived back at the familiar sanctuary of Baker Street, the city was alive with the clatter of horse hooves on cobblestones, the distant cries of street vendors, and the heavy grey smell of coal smoke hanging in the damp air. We climbed the 17 steps to our sitting room, opening the door to the welcoming embrace of Mrs. Hudson's careful tending. The fire in our own hearth was burning brightly, a true, honest fire of seasoned oak and coal, snapping and crackling with a vital energy that warmed the room. The scent of strong black tea and freshly toasted bread drifted up from the tray on the side table, mixing with the lingering, comforting aroma of Holmes' strong shag tobacco. I sank into my armchair with a deep, weary sigh, stretching my hands out toward the warmth of the true fire, watching the dancing flames consume the wood, leaving behind a glowing bed of honest, grey ash. It was a beautiful sight, a testament to the natural order of things, a profound contrast to the sterile, terrifying illusion we had dismantled in the dark hours of the night. Holmes did not sit immediately, but moved toward the mantelpiece, his fingers brushing against the chaotic clutter of his correspondence, before finally settling upon his violin case. He withdrew the instrument with an almost tender reverence, tightening the bow, resting the polished wood beneath his chin. He stood in the warm light of the fire, closing his eyes, and began to play. It was a slow, melancholic melody, a piece of his own composition that seemed to capture the whispering rain, the long shadows of the study, and the quiet, tragic descent of a man blinded by his own ambition. The music filled the sitting room, wrapping around the familiar furniture, smoothing out the frayed edges of the long, sleepless night, and restoring the profound, gentle peace that always followed the unravelling of a dark and complex truth. I closed my eyes, listening to the weeping of the strings, feeling the heat of the fire, and knowing that, for a little while at least, the world was exactly as it should be. The familiar sanctuary of Baker Street wrapped itself around us once more, as the deep hours of the night settled softly over London. Outside the frosted glass of the sitting-room window, the cold rain tapped a sporadic and gentle rhythm, while the distant muffled clatter of a solitary carriage rolling over wet cobblestones faded into the heavy fog. Holmes sat enveloped in the deep cushions of his armchair, his long form relaxed in thoughtful silence as a thick ribbon of fragrant blue smoke drifted upward from the bowl of his briar pipe, mingling with the comforting scents of old paper and steeped tea. I sat opposite him, watching the golden light dance upon the flocked wallpaper, my mind slowly unspooling the strange threads of the case we had just untangled. The fireplace without ashes was no longer a puzzle of cold stone and empty grates, but a mystery laid to rest, its secrets neatly filed away in the quiet archives of my mind. It is always a profound comfort to return from the chilly enigmas of the outside world to a hearth that burns bright and true. As Holmes closed his eyes and allowed the stillness to speak for him, I too felt the heavy and peaceful weight of sleep drawing near. Let the embers of your own evening settle now, sinking deep into the comforting warmth of a quiet room, as the crackling of the fire slows to a gentle whisper. May the night bring you nothing but restful stillness, wrapping you in warmth and carrying you upon the softest currents of dreams until the morning light.